President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, shortly after I announced that I would be retiring from the Senate, President Clinton called and suggested that from time to time I should give a report on some issue facing the nation. And today I am doing that, this time with a few observations about the relationship between China, Taiwan, and the United States. My interest in this subject is more than a sudden thrust caused by recent developments. My parents were Lutheran missionaries in China and had returned to the United States 1 month when I was born. I tell Chinese American audiences that I was made in China. I grew up in a home that had Chinese art, guests, and influence. That gives me no more expertise than others, but I mention it because my interest has been long-standing. Before the Shanghai Communique that recognized the People's Republic of China, I favored recognizing the mainland Chinese government as well as the government on Taiwan. It would have been somewhat similar to our recognizing both West Germany and East Germany as two separate governments. Neither Germany was particularly happy with that, but it acknowledged reality, and it did not prevent the two governments from eventually merging into one Germany. Following that course with China and Taiwan would have been a wiser policy, and it would have acknowledged what is a reality. There are two separate governments. But that did not happen as far as our policy, and hindsight is an easy luxury. The situation now is confusing and could turn dangerous. Our colleague, Senator Dianne Feinstein, has described U.S. policy toward China as one of zigzagging, and that, unfortunately, is an apt description. Let me outline where we are and why I believe a firm and consistent United States policy is desirable for all parties. China has moved generally in a constructive direction since the emergence of Deng Xiaoping's leadership following the death of Mao. All of us who have been visitors there are impressed by the economic gains, and with those gains has come some greater openness within tight constraints, even on political expression, particularly in the southern part of China near Hong Kong. But the violent suppression of those who demonstrated peacefully for human rights at Tiananmen Square shocked Americans and all democratic nations, as well as the thousands of Chinese students in the United States. I remember speaking to a large gathering of Chinese students at Grant Park in Chicago. All of us were stunned by the Chinese government's action. I also joined those who peacefully protested outside the Chinese embassy here in Washington. The benign face of the government of China many had come to expect suddenly turned malevolent. After none too swiftly denouncing the government violence at Tiananmen Square, President Bush sent two of our top officials to Beijing to meet with their leaders. And whatever the content of the talks, the pictures that came back to us on the wire services were of two highly placed Americans toasting the Chinese leadership that had just squelched, in a bloody fashion, the yearning for freedom of many of their people. In the meantime, the nearby island of Taiwan has moved more and more toward the human rights we profess to support. Taiwan now has a multi-party system, a free press, and freedoms that are comparable to those we enjoy. Its parliament is at least as confrontational as is our Congress, and on March 23, there will be an election for president with the incumbent president, Lee Teng-hui, ahead in the polls. It is significant that he is a native Taiwanese. Taiwan has been our 7th leading trading partner and is number 2 in the world in holding foreign currency reserves. Here's where our zigzagging comes in. At least on paper, we applaud democracies and say we will support them and we frown upon dictatorships. But the Shanghai Communique states that the United States will recognize only one China. And so we have turned a diplomatic cold shoulder to Taiwan, showing greater sensitivity to a dictatorship than to a democracy. In terms of power, it is not a choice of two equals. For the same reasons that many in the State Department and Defense Department did not want to recognize Israel, which had significantly more numerous Arabs as neighbors, and have had a tilt toward Turkey in her difficulties with less numerous and less powerful neighbors in Greece and Armenia, so there are many in key positions who say, once again, that the choices should not be made on the merits, but on the numbers and the potential power of the two governments. China has 1.2 billion people, and Taiwan has 21 million. However, there is something that makes many of us uncomfortable when the cold calculations of population and power are used as the overriding criteria in deciding whom we will befriend. When we said, as we did for a period, that President Lee, the chief executive of a democracy, could not come to Cornell University for a reunion of his class because it might offend China, it showed weakness and lack of support for our ideals. Eventually, President Clinton reversed that decision, and I applaud him for it. With an election in Taiwan coming soon, the Chinese government, which certainly must be a top contestant in the bad public relations field, has been making military noises that cause apprehension in Asia and concern everywhere, apparently in a heavy-handed attempt to influence the Taiwanese elections. Complicating the Chinese situation is that they face a transition in leadership, and no potential leader wants to look weak on the issue of absorbing Taiwan into the mainland. So leaders and potential leaders try to one-up each other in sounding tough on Taiwan. The irony is that tough talk makes an eventual peaceful reunion of the two governments less likely. While it is probable that China will not invade Taiwan in the near future or launch a missile attack, people struggling for leadership power sometimes do irrational things, and public officials are risk takers. No one becomes a United States Senator without taking risks, and no one moves into leadership in China without taking risks. What has to be demonstrated to China is that their belligerent talk and actions are creating hostility around the world, and that an invasion or missile strike would be a disaster for the Chinese leadership and the Chinese people. The position of the United States should be one of firmness and patience as China goes through this leadership change, evidencing our strong desire for friendship, but also our determined opposition to the use of force to achieve change. The lesson of history is that dictators who seize territory and receive praise for it from their own controlled media are not likely to have their appetite satisfied with one bite of land. If China should turn militaristic and seize Taiwan, that would be only the first acquisition. Mongolia to the north is a likely next target. And as we should have learned from Hitler, dictators can always find some historical